Hello everyone. Today, as a part of my CAS project, I'll be talking about the war in Yugoslavia, or the war known as the Yugoslavian Civil War, or the breakup of Yugoslavia. Here we have a map of the countries that seceded from Yugoslavia at the end of the war, which all together made the Federation of Yugoslavia. So, why did Yugoslavia break up? Why did it happen at all? So, to talk about it, there are multiple reasons. The most obvious one, nationalism. Under Tito, nationalistic movements and nationalism has been suppressed as he was promoting the idea of being a Yugoslav. And what is a Yugoslav? It's a South Slav in the meaning. Yugo meaning South, Slav meaning Slav, which meant like all the Slavs that lived in the region, including Bulgarians, Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, Slovenians, Macedonians. So under Tito, he suppressed these movements, so people couldn't really express, let's say, desire for independence or seceding from the Union, and all things like that. And in contrast, the idea of one identity was pushed on people, which was relatively accepted by the people. So essentially, people didn't really have many reasons to want to secede. Plus, under Tito, things were going well economically as well. As Yugoslavia was an important country in Europe that was neither part of the Warsaw Pact nor the NATO, it was being supported by both sides, so that it doesn't join any. This benefited Yugoslavia greatly, which allowed it to be the richest socialist country in Europe at that time. However, once the communism fell in the Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia was the only socialist country that remained in Europe, things started getting bad. So, one of the reasons, as I mentioned, was nationalism, and as I mentioned, the second reason was economics, simply. So after Tito's death, for 10 more years, things were still somewhat stable, but until they weren't. So, in the 90s, when communism fell, well, there was no longer a reason to give Yugoslavia money for Americans and neither for Russians, because the Cold War was simply over. And this time also coincided with the time that IMF wanted its money back that was given to Yugoslavia throughout the Cold War. So Yugoslavia was in a financial crisis, and nationalism was rampant as the movements were no longer being suppressed. And it only took one more thing to ignite this mess, which was Slobodan Milosevic, who became the leader of Serbia, and then he dominated the collective leading body of the Yugoslavian Socialist Federation, and then essentially this caused a war as the nation started declaring independence. So what happened? So specifically on the 14th Congress of the Yugoslav Communist Party, Slobodan Milosevic, together with the representative of Montenegro, Kosovo, and Vojvodina, were dominating the collective body, and they were blocking any suggestion by the Slovenian delegation led by Milan Kucan, who later on became the first president of Slovenia. So they left the Congress, and then the Croatians left, and this was essentially the moment that marked the end of Yugoslavia, although the war was still not declared. Another important thing is the election of Franjo Tudjman in Croatia, who reinstated the checkered flag, which is a nationalistic symbol that was also used by the Ustasha during the Second World War, which was perceived badly by the Serbians as a symbol of fascism and also a symbol of the people that oppressed and killed Serbs. So all these things in combination led the first Yugoslavia hosting a referendum, and then on 25th of June 1991 declared independence, which started a short-lasting war, which lasted about 6 days, a week, a few days, and then it was over soon, because the main reason for the wars in the ex-Yugoslavian territory was the fact that Milosevic was okay with the fact that these nations were declaring independence, but he had the idea that if these people had the right to declare independence, so do the Serbs in these regions had the right to declare independence. This is also a reason why the war was between Serbian organizations in Croatia and Bosnia. So after this declaration of independence of Slovenia, same day Croatia also declared independence. And on that day, many of the Serbs living in the Croatian area, mainly in these areas in Croatia, where the Serbs constituted, let's say, a fair proportion of the society. They were setting roadblocks, they were, let's say, organizing, and they were organizing militias, and they also organized a referendum of their own after boycotting the one that was done by the Croatians. So, this started the war in Croatia. So, in this war, the Yugoslav troops entered Croatia, especially the areas that were dominated by the Serbs in Croatia, and the Croatians were fighting with their volunteer forces, as the Yugoslav army was under control of Serbia at the time. And they had organized, for example, the local police force into a militia by the guns smuggled from Hungary. So, at the end of this war, it was agreed that Serbs will be resettled into Serbia, so the ethnic issue was solved this way. And the important events in this war is, for example, the siege of Dubrovnik here and the siege of Vukovar, which became a symbol for the war in Croatia. However, that was not the bloodiest part of the war. The bloodiest part of the war happened once Bosnia declared its independence on 1st March 1992, as Bosnia consists of 3 groups on its own. So, Bosnia consists of Serbs dominating these areas roughly, Croatians living in these areas, and then Muslims living in these areas known as Bosnians. So, when Bosnia declared independence, so did the Bosnian Serbs under Karadzic. And they started fighting over territory that was contested. So, for example, there was siege of Sarajevo here, which was bloody and it lasted for about a year. It's one of the longest sieges in Europe. And another important thing is like what happened on Srebrenica. Essentially, after the capture of Srebrenica by the Serbian forces, the civilians there seek refuge in a UN camp, and eventually the UN soldiers there could not protect them, so they agreed to hand them over to the Serbian forces, which executed all the males aged from 16 on by the assumption that they all fought against them. So, in this part, although at the start Croatians were also fighting for territory thanks to the involvement of the Western powers, they agreed to support Bosnians, and then in the year 1995, at Dayton, with the initiative of the Americans, a peace treaty was signed on 14th December 1995, which kept the borders, as you can see here, just with the fact that Bosnia was divided into 2 regions, not Bosnia and Herzegovina, but Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then Republika Srpska, which has autonomy as most of its population is made out of Serbians. However, this was far from the end of the war. And also, it should be mentioned that while during these events, both Macedonia also declared its independence. However, this was not the last war, neither the last seceded country in Yugoslavia. Essentially, the things that started in Kosovo, like the independence movements were fired in Kosovo because in the 1990, Slobodan Milosevic revoked the autonomy of Kosovo, which spiked protests. And this was essentially the reason why everyone else feared the same thing of Serbification, and which pushed them to declare independence. And the war was going to end in really it started essentially. So in 20th of February 1998, there was clashes between UÇK, which is the Kosovo Liberation Army, and Yugoslavian forces. And the conflict ended in 11th of June 1999 after the NATO bombings of Serbia, which led to them accepting a ceasefire and giving Kosovo a period to negotiate what will happen or if they will declare independence or not. And after the war in Kosovo, Montenegro had its own referendum in which they seceded. So, essentially, this was the history of Yugoslavia's breakup. I hope you enjoyed it and you'll find this video helpful. So, see you in next videos.